I am going to tackle a somewhat sensitive subject in this video here for fantasy fans because magic systems are in a lot of ways the soul of the books we really love, depending on what type of fantasy fan you are, but a huge portion of fantasy audiences really love digging deep into the magic systems presented in the stories they care about and discussing them endlessly. So for me, making a video where I am going to give my thoughts on the rules and how magic systems should be made is going to be slightly controversial. I'm sure I'm going to make some people mad, especially because a decent chunk of this video is going to be a form of response to Brandon Sanderson's rules of magic and the thing that I refer to in my head as the cult of Brandon. Now, I want to point out I'm firmly a member of this cult. I think the Cosmere is one of the most brilliant things to ever be written in fantasy, and I'm a pretty large fan myself. So I'm not in any way, shape, or form trying to imply that Brandon's rules do not work for him. In fact, let's just go ahead and jump into it right now. Let's address the cult of Brandon.
We'll go ahead and start.
So, as I said, in no way, shape, or form do I think Brandon's rules not work for him. And I also don't believe Brandon is the source of the problem for what I'm about to address, because he very directly states in his famous online lecture about magic systems, well, I'll just let the man speak for himself.
These are not necessary laws that I think everyone needs to follow, because rule number one of this class and writing instruction is try it out. If it works for you, keep using it. If it doesn't work for you, throw it away. Most likely, you will adapt it to your own needs, and then it will become a tool that is useful for you.
So these rules are really great. And I think if you're trying to specifically write a hard magic system, they are good ones to at least use as a touchstone to jump off of. If you're not familiar with Brandon's rules, I'm not going to go over them here, but I will link to a video I made down below and in a card by my head where you can go learn about Brandon's magic systems in a more condensed video that's not quite as long as his hour-plus long lecture. Or you can check out the lecture itself, which I'll also link down below. It's fascinating to see him dive in deep about these ideas. But I want to go ahead and make it just absolutely clear. I do believe Brandon Sanderson's formula, especially if you're just getting started writing magic systems, is a good place to maybe start and work from. And I do think it works for him remarkably well. Stormlight, Warbreaker, Mistborn, Elantris, all of these books have some of the best magic systems you can come across in modern fantasy. My message here isn't for Brandon. I'm not going to try and challenge the man himself. It's for his audience, which I find mildly irks me, where they are constantly, I see online or in discussions I've had with friends of mine who are Brandon fans, comparing other magic systems to his, and they will a lot of the times tend to devalue magic systems they feel don't follow his rules well enough, or they just always compare systems to his, even if those magic systems are trying to be something very different than what Brandon often crafts in his worlds. And that's why in this video, I'm going to propose an alternative scale from hard versus soft, something that seems so binary, and even though it should be considered a spectrum, has so many people just kind of going hard to one side or hard to the other, when I think that's not how this should work at all. It's more of a gray field of mishmash. Even the hardest magic systems bend rules at times, and we're going to get into that more in a minute. I dread the day when this idea that these rules are fundamental to crafting a good magic system results in almost every magic system being peddled through this formula, because I think many of the greatest fantasy magic systems of all time, all the way back to before Tolkien, followed absolutely no rules like this whatsoever, because they didn't care about soft versus hard, they cared about wonder versus rule-based. And this is kind of my alternative scale I wish to push forward here. I don't think I have the power to completely change the narrative on how magic systems are talked about in the fantasy community. That's insane. But among my fan base in my Discord, if we could just have some kind of concerted effort to, instead of thinking hard versus soft, instead think about, well, there's a spectrum from 1 to 10. And nothing's a 10, nothing's a 1. And we're gonna go, is the intent from the author to inspire wonder at times, or is it to have a rigid rule system which allows fantasy fans in a very fun and promotional way through your fan base, which I do think is a really engaging part of the fantasy community, to have these discussions about the rules and implications, and that's great. But I don't think that's 100% what the conversation should be. I also love magic systems that are based in this idea of wonder first. I think Harry Potter's a very good idea of that. Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings is one of the most mythic and wonderful figures ever crafted, because he's able to just pull this metaphorical rabbit out of a hat in whatever situation he's in and promote this wonder of The Lord of the Rings. He has such an otherworldly and grander feel to him because he has very few rules that constrain his abilities. Do you see how that level of wonder can actually raise stakes and elevate a character? That's something that I feel like is often lost when we have these stringent rules of crafting a good magic system you must follow, because I just disagree with that. And we're seeing this bias towards hard magic system become more and more prevalent. I don't think among hardcore fantasy fans, I think most of them are well read enough and knowledgeable enough to think, that's not necessarily the case. But as we see fantasy get more popular and more people just read a couple of series, very often Brandon ones, because he has this incredible ability to be an introduction to the genre. I have a friend I just gave Mistborn because I know it's a phenomenal entry to fantasy that I think she'll really enjoy. But because their introduction tends to be these harder systems now, people tend to have their first time bias and now go, oh, this is the type of magic system I like. And hey, that's actually okay. If these are the kind of magic systems you like, that's great. Go read Brent Weeks. Go read other people who like to have these more stringent magic systems. But I just want to have the ability to maintain in the conversation that a wonder first as the priority magic system is, to me, much more pure fantasy in a way, and should never be discounted or had its nose turned up at. So for aspiring authors out there, I encourage everyone to develop maybe their own formula that doesn't necessarily depend on Brandon's rules. Once you get more experience, if you're just starting out, maybe try out his rules. Maybe you'll love developing them that way, maybe you won't. I personally, in my book I'm crafting right now, have a, I would say, rule-first magic system on one side and a more wonder-based magic system on the other. Some people are going to hear wonder and they're going to think like childish, but no, I just mean wonder in the sense that it's otherworldly, it's driven by gods, and it's not something that the human mind is supposed to be able to comprehend or come fully to terms with. And I think that's also an advantage you can have when you don't necessarily have these harder rules. It's going to be difficult for Brandon, I feel, down the road to have anything that feels beyond comprehension in his worlds if he continues to have this stringent adherence to these rules first, because there are, maybe in this Lovecraftian mindset I like to promote when it comes to building a fantasy world, things that I think should be beyond the reader's comprehension, should be beyond rules the mortal mind could understand. That's really cool in fantasy that we have that ability. And also, I'm fully aware Brandon definitely could, and I maybe even has written things like that. I'm not trying to say that he's limited in any way. Don't take this video as a shot at the guy who I love so dearly as an author. I just definitely want to help people realize that when it comes to what fantasy is at its core, magic systems, or magic in general, even systems, applies a level of stringency I don't necessarily should exist 100%, but magic should be completely free to bend to the creative mind of the author. And if this person doesn't necessarily want a magic system that's all about raising stakes, that's okay to me. That's something that I think is healthy to exist. Fantasy should be allowed to not constrain to rules, whether it's dabbling in the absurd or the otherworldly or the beyond comprehension. I just don't want to see fans discount something because they don't think it follows a set of rules they're under the impression it must follow. And that actually puts responsibility on you as the reader. It's up to you as the reader to find out what your preference is and remind yourself not to discount anything that happens to not be your preference. Something I struggled with as a long time as a reviewer is finding the balance between objectively bad versus not my taste. I put that burden on you as well when you're talking about books in casual conversation. Please always make sure to distinguish between I just happen to not like versus this is bad, because those are two entirely different conversations that people tend to bring into one, especially when it comes to things that are very mushy and up to interpretation, like a magic system. So the first large chunk of this video is just devoted towards addressing what I feel like is a trend right now in fantasy that maybe isn't as big a problem as I see, but you have to understand I'm reading a lot of YouTube comment section, and that probably makes me think things are worse than they are sometimes. Hey, we've established that I think really magic systems should not be labeled as hard and soft, and it should be more understood as a spectrum, and I want to relabel that spectrum just to promote the idea that it's a scale to wonder-based versus rule-based, because I think that just communicates more effectively to even the most shallow understanding of the fantasy genre person that everything's going to be a bit more flex and flow rather than binary. So moving past beyond here, how could I possibly continue to make comments in this video about writing fantasy magic systems when I've essentially just said, hey, follow no rules, don't care about what other people are saying, just as an author have complete freedom to write and create what fits within your world? Well, there's a couple bits of advice I can put on top of that. And this is just from things I've noticed in response from readers that I think have been pretty much across the board in terms of what does and doesn't work for introducing and executing magic systems. So we've established how to have fundamental concepts, but now let's talk about the introduction of these concepts into your world. How do you inject them into the reader's mind? I think something that is really important when it comes to especially introducing the first few experiences with your magic system, I would recommend having the rules, even if you are in a more rule-based magic system, still held back. Because even the magic systems that fall way onto that side of the scale where rules come first, I think readers across the board like having that first exposure to this magic system be a wonderful experience, be something that they don't entirely understand and can enjoy in that moment. And after this moment of introduction, where you have this display of power, which is going to awe your reader if you write it well, and is going to be something that definitely differentiates you from the rest of fantasy if your magic system is unique to you as an author, then you can decide, do I want to explain the rules and how this works? If so, to what length and level? And I just really definitely have seen consistently over-explaining a magic system before it's executed can very much so mute that first impression of the fantastical elements of your world. So keep that in mind. Again, that's a subjective opinion. You can feel free to disagree with me. Everything in writing is a subjective opinion. Almost literally everything. But I think this one will be agreed with by about 90% of fantasy viewers, because even people who fall on that very rule-based side of things can enjoy a flashy show at the beginning. The next thing I'm going to definitely push, and this is not about introduction, it's more about execution, is no matter what, if your magic system is again on either side of this spectrum, make sure that it is not purely existing to drive the plot. Because the more you do that, the more you're going to detract from your characters driving the plot, which is an inherently more compelling thing to read. You fall in love with characters and who they are, and you want to see them and the decisions they make drive the story. Now, if you fall on the much more rule-based side of things, you can definitely have your magic system more tied into how the plot is progressed through your characters figuring things out or exploiting this magic system in a new way. But especially if you're on the more wonderful side of magic, really you might want to hold back from magic driving the plot, because this is something that Brandon touches on in this lecture and I think is inherently true. Magic just solving problems without understanding and being the solution, even in the harder side of things, I believe, even if it's somewhat earned, can just murder stakes. I think it's much healthier as an author to be in the practice of, how does my character solve this? Maybe with magic, but in a way that is understood. Even in a wonderful magic system, we can understand some things and have it used that way. I just want to push this, that for me, so many times reading a fantasy book, I have had a magic system just murder the stakes of a story because the author doesn't understand that, I'm just using magic to solve problems, and it's not because of the character, it's because of a magical loophole that's not understood or set up. So we have something about introduction here, and we have something about really the execution, especially at the climax of your story. Don't just allow the magic to solve things, because you want it to. I've seen this especially in probably the most infamous review on my channel with my Good Kind review. There are things that just happened in Sword of Truth that were completely unearned. And what was even more frustrating is there are really decent magical ideas in that book, but they are so not set up and they are so just out of the blue that they just end up hurting what's more important to the enjoyment of the story for me, the plot. So if you would like an example of what not to do and how that can be undercut, I do recommend Sword of Truth for that purpose. Some people will point to Mistborn, where a character figures something out with the magic system and that is then able to progress the plot. But what is really important to note there is this is an aspect of the magic system which is set up almost like a mathematical formula, and it's a logical conclusion to reach that is reached by a character and makes sense with who she is. So I kept that spoiler free by being vague, but that is an important distinction to make. And the final thing I want to really touch on, of course there's a million others I could, because writing a magic system is hard, and really it's just going to take practice and rewrites and reading your own things, especially out loud to yourself, to process and reconfigure. But one thing I want to absolutely stress that I think is maybe just as, if not more important than everything else I've said here: have fun with it. That's going to sound childish and maybe a little like, what are you talking about? The moments that stand out in these fantastical stories when it comes to their magic systems and make them really resonate and become something we want to use in our daily lives are the moments with characters where they're able to have fun with or experience something truly awesome with a magic system. If you're wonderful, maybe that awesome is a bit easier to achieve, but no matter what, try to exploit those features to make it so you have moments and scenes where your readers are pumping their fists or just enjoying the fact that these magical elements exist. Amazing example of an author doing this is pretty much like every 5 chapters in Lightbringer. Brent Weeks is doing something with his drafting magic system that is just either badass and cool or an inventive thing for a character. Just he's having fun with the idea that he has a very flexible and bendy magic system that has a lot of different utility-based uses in fights or just daily life, and he's having fun as a writer exploring that. And I enjoyed that every time it happened in Lightbringer. Whether it's just seeing his drafting used in an inventive way, which made me go, oh, that's so cool, I wouldn't have thought of that, but it makes complete sense. Or just a character having fun with making a bouncy ball out of their magic and using it in a fight. It's hilarious, and it makes me actually just constantly think back to this magic system with a fond energy about it. Having fun with your magic system does not kill stakes, it does not lessen the validity of the seriousness of your magic system. If anything, it just humanizes the characters that are using it and makes it almost feel more real, because let's be honest, if you or I had magic available to us, we'd do some irresponsible fun shit with it, wouldn't we? Anyway, that's the message I want to leave this video on. Let me know your favorite magic systems in the comments down below, and let me know just on a scale of like 2 to 9, because no one's a 1 and no one's a 10. You might think you are, but I really doubt you are. Where do you fall on that wonder at 2 and rule-based at 9 spectrum? Do you like just hard rules that can almost never be bent, that are so rigid, or do you really enjoy the wonder aspect of fantasy, where you're just constantly feeling like there's things beyond comprehension, or you just don't know? Let me know. I'm really curious to see what people have to say. Anyway, guys, like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a good one, y'all. Peace. I just wanted to give my Patreons a little special treat here. So, mwah. Oh yeah, kiss that one. Mwah. Oh look. Oh, mwah. Told you I love my Patreons. Mwah. I love them so much. They're the greatest people. Mwah. Oh, it's like we're best friends now. I mean it. Let's open bars together. Let's start a community where I'm the leader and we're on a farm. I think this has been done before, and it had just a great ending. Let's do it. Let's call ourselves a family. Let's be a family together. Let's be a unit.